Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Helsing. I'm the director of the Better Evidence Project and an associate professor here at the Carter School. Welcome to our panel that's focused on research and the importance of connecting local to national, global, and welcome to Peace Week. I hope you've been able to enjoy other panels, discussions, and there will be many others to enjoy during the rest of this week. Very briefly, this panel is meant to do two things. One is to highlight some of the research that's being done by the broader Better Evidence Project team here at the Carter School. But it's also an opportunity to sort of have us think about the importance of research that has as its goal sort of a tie to practice in peace building out in the world. One of the things that we do at the Better Evidence Project is that we try to curate resources that are going to bridge theory and practice. And that's very much part of the ethos of the Carter School in trying to connect theory and practice. Many of the faculty at the Carter School are themselves practitioners in some way, shape, or form. So that's very much part of the kind of the ethos of sort of a school that's focused on conflict resolution and peace building. Additionally, what we want to do is we want to highlight the fact that scholarship, research, and the bridging of theory and practice is very much a global enterprise. And what I mean by that is we learn from each other by gaining perspectives that are not those that we're normally used to getting. And I say that because each of our four presenters, even though they are all students at the Carter School, they're all part of the Better Evidence Project team, none of them are Americans. So they are bringing their own sort of lens to the issues that we look at in the broader conflict resolution and peace building field. And that's what we're trying to promote broadly, is to amplify the voices, the scholarship, the research, not just about conflict issues, but about getting a lens and a perspective that broadens our own learning in the peace building and conflict field. So with that sort of as kind of laying the groundwork for what we're going to do, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Camila Elyazgi, who is the program manager for the Better Evidence Project and the resource center that we're developing. And she will start by introducing the panel. So Camila.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, so I'm going to start off by introducing each of our panelists in the order in which they're going to present. And then I'll talk just a little bit more about what we're doing at the Better Evidence Project. So NG Saeed is a PhD candidate at the Carter School and also a current fellow at the Weatherhead Scholars Program at Harvard University. Her research explores how the ongoing conflict in Syria has changed the nature of the Syrian economy and economic governance since 2011. Hee-Joo Chon is also a PhD candidate at the Schar School of Policy and Government and a recipient of a Doctoral Research Scholars Award from the Provost's Office. Her research focuses on the relationship between nonviolent action, mass mobilization, and levels of democracy. Amy Desideri is a recent graduate from the master's program in conflict resolution and Mediterranean security at the Carter School's Malta program. And she has been focused on issues in the Sahel. And finally, Isabella Cuevas is a master's student at the Carter School, as well as the outreach coordinator at the Better Evidence Project. And she was a 2023 recipient of a GMU Oscar Research Fellowship that allowed her to do conflict facilitation fieldwork in a village in Colombia. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit more about what we're doing at the Better Evidence Project. So the Better Evidence Project seeks to improve the evidence that's available to practitioners, donors, policymakers, and scholars in the peacebuilding community. And by so doing, strengthen our collective efforts to build sustainable peace and address the problems of war and violence. To do this, we have a few priority areas. So first is we are actively curating essentially a virtual library of open source documents, resources, and materials from all around the world that will enable better informed decisions, projects, and priorities. Second is promoting indicators of change that reflect success in peace building and conflict resolution and prevention efforts, while also highlighting what has not worked. Third is learning from local peace building successes. And finally, the creation of a peace building hub and connecting peace builders from around the world. With that, I'll turn it back over to Jeff if you want to add anything, or if we're going to jump into our...
Nothing to add. So let's turn to Angie and learn more about what she's been working on. Angie?
Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm happy to be participating in this session with you today and to share with you my work, the recent work that I've been doing on the conflict economy in Syria. So the motivation behind my research was an interest in understanding how conflict economies function. There is a pre-assumption in literature that when conflict happens, institutions break down and everything converts into a war economy. But then in recent years, we've seen that when conflicts happen, markets function, schools continue, hospitals are working, some investments even keep going during conflict. And this aspect of the formal economy is not normally covered in much of the literature on conflict economy. So I wanted to examine the formal part of the conflict economy to see how that works, and to look at economic power and agency of economic actors during the conflict. My research looks at the relationship between the state and the private sector, to see how, if these relations are totally independent or there is a dependence between the state and the private sector during conflict. Of course, to do that, I provide an overview on institutional structures that existed before the conflict, because these structures either collapse during the conflict or some elements of it continue. Sometimes they don't even collapse. Institutional structures continue when conflict erupts, and they are able to maintain the resilience and probably end the conflict at an earlier phase. And the research focuses on Syria, and my choice was influenced by my interest in the region, coming from the Middle East, but also the identity-centric explanations that are often used or employed to explain the current conflicts in the Middle East. If we look at Syria or Lebanon or Iraq or Yemen or Libya, the main discourse that have been employed to explain these conflicts has focused more on identity-centric explanations. And to me, while these explanations are valid, to a great extent, when conflict erupts, identity becomes more salient, but then they are limited in their scope in that they do not really show the complexity of the conflict dynamics. So if you look at in the Middle East, when conflict erupted, it erupted because of people going to the street to protest, calling for economic and political reforms. They wanted more economic opportunity that identity-centric approaches do not explain. So what we know from the literature on conflict economies is that poverty and inequality are major causes of conflict. Research by economists like Paul Collier from the World Bank or Francis Stewart and Sederman, they have all shown through large comparative data sets that when poverty and inequality exist, this can create the potential for a conflict. While this research was very important in directing the attention to the economic causes of conflict, it had a major limitation in that it did not provide context to the data sets that it uses to make the argument. And it also varied in the variables that scholars on the economic causes of conflict use to explain why poverty and inequality are causes of conflict. So you find different variables, and so the results cannot normally be generalized. And to move into more context in my research, I look at institutions. There is a lot of research. This research is mainly in economics, institutional economics in particular, that makes the case that institutions matter and why some countries achieve economic growth, why others stagnate. So I try to use this literature to see if institutions also influence conflict dynamics through creating poverty and inequality, looking at power bargains between economic and political elites and the incentive structures that they use to distribute economic wealth and resources. So the two institutions that I'm interested in exploring are state and business sector, the business sector. And the reason I'm using these institutions is that these are two powerful political and economic institutions that control the market. And I use a political economy lens to explore state-business relations in order to employ a multidisciplinary approach that looks at the politics, but also the economic aspect of these relationships. So going to the case study in Syria, this month actually we mark the 13th anniversary of the conflict in Syria. And the conflict, which started in 2011, was described as the worst man-made disaster the world has seen since World War II by the UN. The conflict has erupted and transformed from peaceful protests to a very violent armed conflict. And we'll see some figures on the humanitarian tolls of the conflict shortly. But then over the past 13 years, the conflict has transformed, has passed through different phases, from very high intensity violence to periods of, relative calm, kind of, conflict freezing parts. The fighting has led to the fragmentation of the political and economic landscape in Syria, and also the territorial landscape. So as per, I used this graph in my dissertation proposal defense, and that was from 2022. But as I checked the figures and the areas of control as per this year, it seems that the conflict has not really moved forward since then. You see on the map that The green part is the area that is controlled by the regime. The yellow part is the area that is controlled by Kurdish forces and Arab forces. The blue part is the part controlled by rebel groups like armed opposition and some extremist groups. And the purple part is the one controlled by militias that are allied with Turkey. So the conflict has actually led to the fragmentation of the land. This wasn't the case in 2015 and 16. The areas controlled by the regime were less. There were more areas controlled by opposition groups. But this is the case as it stands right now. And with this fragmentation, it brings major implications to the economic governance and performance of the Syrian economy as a whole. So to take a look at some numbers, the Syrian population before the conflict stood at almost 22 million people. But the conflict has led to the displacement of 13 million people. 7.6 are IDPs, they are displaced in Syria. Most of them are displaced in areas that suffer from very high level of poverty and impacted by extreme violence. And 5.4 million are refugees in neighboring countries. As of now, as of this year, around 15.3 million people in Syria are in need of humanitarian assistance, as per the UN figures. If we look at the economy before the conflict, it is always, okay, it's assumed that conflict happened and due to poverty. But if we look at the Syrian economy, we discover that actually Syria was doing well economically before the conflict. GDP was growing really fast up till 2010 before the conflict. It has averaged around 4.4% for the 9 years before the conflict. And employment was also, unemployment was also declining a bit, except for 2008, where it witnessed a surge, but then it began declining again. So the Syrian economy was actually doing well. And Syria is not a low-income country, but if we looked at indicators before the fighting, it was a middle-income country. So theories that look at poverty do not really explain conflicts that happen in middle-income countries. Despite that growth, there was definitely urban-rural inequality. And farmers in particular were suffering because of a multi-year drought that the country has witnessed from 2004 until 2008, which has impacted around 2 million farmers and has led to has impacted 60% of the agricultural land. The current state of the economy is dire. The economy has contracted sharply due to the conflict. Unemployment has reached almost 60%. The GDP has lost more than 60% of its pre-conflict values. The labor force is pushed into the informal economy, and around 2/3 of the population are living in extreme poverty. Most of the sectors are affected to different extents: agriculture, manufacturing, oil and gas, either due to the fighting or due to the shortages in fuel and power and raw material, and the access to finance. And this contraction of the economy has implications on the state and its relationship with the business community that I'll turn to now. Just to give you a brief overview on how state business relations in Syria were before the conflict, I divide these relations into 3 phases that the country has witnessed. In the post-independent period, Syria had a pretty liberal market economy. But that period did not stay for long, because when the Ba'ath Party came to power, it tried to assert its control by controlling the economy to reduce the power of the business elite that existed. They did that through land reforms and distribution of economic wealth. When Hafez al-Assad came to power in the 1970s, he tried to open up the space a little bit for the business sector. mainly the capitalists that existed before the Ba'ath Party came to power. But that opening was very careful and was very limited in scope and only confined to a selected part of the elite. But then since Bashar al-Assad came to power, he started implementing economic liberalization. And that was mainly motivated by the decline of the revenue base of the government, given the decline in oil reserves. The government started deregulating and diversifying the economy and opening up the space for the private sector. And that period has led to the opening of private banks for the first time, and also the reopening of the stock market after 40 years from its closure. Despite that opening up for the business sector, the economic structure of Syria remained highly dependent on the state. That in a lot of literature, it's described as a patrimonial system. There is a political elite that is dependent on a military apparatus, and then there is an economic elite that is totally dependent on the political elite. So their access to state power is the main source of their privilege and profits. Given the dependency of the business elite on the state, the position that they took during the conflict depended on their closeness or lack of on the regime. While the regime was able to re-centralize during the conflict, business elites who are very closely tied to the regime, they didn't defect or withdraw. The ones that were not that dependent on the regime, they had more mobility by either supporting more mobility to take position, to support or to withdraw from the economy. The small businesses, they try to survive. Like it's either win or lose. If they can continue given the contraction of the economy and the weak conditions, they continue. If they can, they just shut down their businesses. From the research that I've been doing so far, and this is still a research in progress, so I'm conducting interviews and the data keeps evolving based on different experiences that I'm finding. But what can be noticed in general on the position of the private sector, the business elite during the conflict is that we had already a business sector that was in operation. When the conflict happened, some decided to withdraw and others decided to continue. Those who withdrew from the economy, they withdrew either because of security reasons. They found that the environment is insecure for them to continue, or out of a political position, moral position because of a conflict, or the sanctions. Their businesses was impacted by the sanctions imposed on the Syrian regime. So they decided to just leave. The ones who left, the regime was very quick to adapt to the withdrawal from the economy by filling the gap with new economic elite. This elite was born in the context of the violence, so they became highly dependent on the regime. And they performed different functions as such, either by supporting indirectly some militias, like paying salaries or providing more revenues to the regime to be able to support the fighting, or some of them continued just businesses, paying taxes. Some of them played the role in the conflict by mediating between the regime and armed groups for trade purposes. And some fronts was used by the regime to actually evade sanctions. The old elite that did not withdraw from the economy, their position was based on either the fragmentation of the opposition, that they could not find an alternative except to stay close to the regime, or the sanctions have impacted them and they were not able to conduct business otherwise, so they thought to take opportunity of the war economy that erupted, or the type of sector, the type of business that they do. So people who were engaged in trade were easier to relocate to other countries, but people who have invested on manufacturing or heavy industry where it's so hard to relocate their investment, they had to stay. Some people who did not withdraw liquidified some of their assets, so they reduced their operation. Some partnered with the regime, and that was a continuation of the relationship that existed before the conflict. And others were forced to pay extra taxes that they could not because of the contraction of the economy and decline of the revenue base, so they just had to downscale. And those who did not comply, their assets were confiscated. So you see that the private sector tried to adapt either way, either by withdrawing if they do not want to have a stake in the conflict, or they find it insecure, that depended on their ability to actually make that decision, or did not withdraw and either decide to remain in business or go out from business. The regime was also so quick in adapting to the change in the private sector by bringing new figures to replace businessmen who decided to withdraw, so that it continued to have a source of revenue, a resource that you can use. The two parts that are outside the regime area. So an interesting fact about the parts that are controlled by the regime is that the formal economy to an extent continued. You find an institutionalized economy, not just a war economy. The two exist hand in hand, but institutions have shown some kind of resilience. The parts that are controlled by rebel groups and extremist groups, they have shown more forms of the traditional war economy that is available in literature, and that one that is based on looting, that is based on kidnapping, that is based on illicit activities and trafficking. Even though in Idlib, the rebel groups are trying now to establish some form of institutional structures that would enable them to maintain the economy and perform better. But you find that in these institutional structures that they are creating, they are also creating a network of loyal beneficiaries. So the same trend being repeated in areas that are not under the control of the government. And in areas under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish and Arab forces, the economy is based on profits from oil sales, because these areas are rich in oil. Oil has sustained the economy in these areas, even though it's way less in terms of revenues, and still smuggling in these areas continue. So the conflict economy in Syria has created a very diffused landscape. That diffusion is primarily due to the fragmentation of the territory, the economy, and political actors. But it has also led to the emergence of a political economy that sustained the institutional structure that exists in areas under the government control and prevented the collapse of major institutions. It has also led to the formation of a system of interdependency that is so hard to penetrate. This system consists of a state-business nexus that is very strong, a business network that is loyal to the regime because it has emerged out of conflict, because it's sanctioned, because it's hard to conduct business elsewhere. So their fate is basically tied to the regime. And it has also created an internal economic transaction between the state and the opposition groups. The interesting part is that national businesses, most of them stay when conflict erupts. FDI is the first to withdraw. And the importance of the continuation of local businesses is that we should think about ways in which we engage with these businesses to transform the conflict. Because these businesses not only have high risk appetite where they can invest in post-conflict reconstruction situations where there's a high economic uncertainty, but they also have a high ability to adapt. And then when we look at the business landscape in conflict-affected countries, I think it's very important to see what informed the decision to stay or leave. We would think that insecurity would make most of the businesses leave, but in fact, some of them decide to invest in highly insecure areas. And that is always influenced by either the loyalty, but also the type of business and sector, and the level of dependency on the regime. I'll leave it here, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you, Angie. And it's a really important additional lens through which to look at the conflict in Syria. If anybody has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just hold them for when we finish all the presentation. So, Hiju.
Okay. So, hi. I am a PhD candidate in the Schar School of Policy and Government, and I am honored to be part of Peace Week panel. My research focuses on the relationship between mass mobilization and the level of democracy. My research question starts as, how does the size and duration of mass mobilization interact with regime types and tactics, such as like nonviolent and violent, to affect the level of democracy? This question is central to understanding the dynamics of political change and the role of citizens in shaping their governance. By investigating how different aspects of mass mobilization influence democracy, I aim to uncover insights that can inform both theory and practice in the realm of political activism. So, inspired by groundbreaking work of Chenoweth, Stephan, and Ohlfeather, scholars have explored the effectiveness of nonviolent protests in fostering democracy and social cohesion. This body of research has not only shaped the strategies of protest groups worldwide, but has also fueled ongoing debates on the efficacy of nonviolence in promoting democracy. Despite the significant advancements, there is still unanswered questions. The research by Albrecht and Kohler and Codivar, they unveiled the influence of factors such as campaign size and duration on democracy level. However, there remains a gap in understanding the nuanced impact of these factors on level of democracy. For example, previous studies used a dichotomous measure for democracy, which means they measured the democracy as either one equal to democracy or zero as other or autocracy. However, since democracy is a continuous measure, a more intricate approach is needed. And this is especially crucial when considering variation in regime types and the nature of campaigns, whether nonviolent or violent. I categorize democracy into 5 groups. As we can see, the groups are full autocracy regime, partial autocracy, partial democracy with fractionalism, partial democracy without fractionalism, and full democracy. And as we can see, the number of full autocracies, this light blue line, rapidly decreased around 1990s, while the number of partial democracy without fractionalism increased over time. And partial autocracy, partial democracy with fractionalism, and full democracy didn't change much over time. For the data set, I use 3 data sets for this study. First, I utilize Polity5 data to measure the democracy level. The Polity score indicates +10 as strongly democratic and -10 as strongly autocratic. And secondly, I use VDEM data in order to use the annual information on campaign size and duration. And lastly, I use NAVCO dataset that provides annual information on nonviolent and violent mass mobilization. So with these datasets, here are the list of countries in the dataset. There are 170 countries from 1960s to 2018 with over 8,000 observations. I won't go over into details due to time constraints, but here are the countries. And within these countries, there have been a lot of mass mobilization going on, and I categorize mass mobilization into 5 groups. First, there's the total mass mobilization, and then I divided them into mobilization for democracy and mobilization for autocracy. So mobilization for democracy indicates whether they're organized with the explicit aim to advance or protect democratic institutions such as free and fair elections or freedom of association and speech. And mobilization for autocracy indicates whether they're organized explicitly in support of non-democratic rulers and forms of government such as a one-party state, monarchy, or military dictatorships. And among the mobilization for democracy, I also divided them into nonviolent and violent campaigns for the further study. So here are some descriptive statistics. Here is the trend of campaign sizes over years. So within 5 mobilization groups, we can see that all campaign groups are experiencing a gradual increase over time, except for the autocratic campaigns. And for the average campaign duration by campaign types, we can see that for all campaigns, for example, the average campaign duration for all campaigns is little over 2 years. And for autocratic campaigns, their duration is about little over 3 years. And for nonviolent campaigns, their average duration is less than a year. So in order to analyze the impact of the size and duration of the campaign on democracy level, I used dynamic panel data regression model with fixed effects, with country fixed effects, including lagged independent variables up to 30 years. So I am still, it's actually ongoing project. I'm analyzing how the size and duration of the campaign affect the democracy level. It can affect right after the campaign has occurred, or it can actually, the impact can occur after a year or 2 years, or even after 30 years. So that's what I am analyzing. And so in this equation, the beta 1 is the coefficient of interest in my study. The the beta one indicates the effect of the change in the campaign size and duration variables on the change in the democracy level. So here are the little preliminary results. This significance level is here and there is a little varied by regime type and the type of campaign size. But if you look over here, for example, it means that when there's 1 unit change in campaign size for democracy, like pro-democracy campaign size, it actually decreased the level of democracy by 1.993 under full autocracy regime. So it means that under full autocracy, if there is bigger campaign going on for democracy, it actually results in a decrease in democracy level. Generally, it looks like until partial democracy regime, the size of the campaign, regardless of their types, mostly negatively impact the democracy level. But when we come to the partial democracy, we can see the positive impact of campaign size. So for example, under partial democracy, when the campaign size got bigger, the level of democracy increased by 0.573. And for campaign, nonviolent campaign, when the campaign size got bigger, the democracy level increased by 15. While if there is a violent campaign, then it actually decreased the democracy level. And for the campaign duration, it also has similar impact. So, for example, until partial democracy, we can still see if there's a longer campaign going on in the country, then it actually decreased democracy level. But we can see some positive impact of durations. So, for example, under partial autocracy, when there is nonviolent campaign that is going on for more than like years, longer nonviolent campaigns can actually result in increase in democracy level by 1.7. And also for under partial democracy, if there is a pro-democracy campaign going on for longer time, then it actually results in a positive change in the country's democracy level. So the results show that campaign size and duration have varying impacts on democracy levels across different regime types. And for the impact of campaign size, contrary to conventional wisdom, larger campaigns seem to undermine democracy in full autocracy, partial autocracy, and partial democracy with fractionalism. However, they contribute to democratic progress in partial democracy regimes. And for the campaign duration, the results reveal a consistent negative effect on democracy levels across most regime types. However, there are exceptions in partial autocracy and partial democracy where campaign duration shows positive effect by nonviolent campaigns and pro-democracy campaigns. Furthermore, the findings indicates that violent campaigns in particular pose a threat to democracy, especially in partial democracy contexts. So in conclusion, understanding the interplay between mass mobilization dynamics and democracy level can inform more effective strategies for fostering democratic progress and sustaining peace in conflict-affected societies. So thank you. And since I thought the presentation should be limited to 10 minutes, I kind of deleted a lot of things from my slides. So, and my study is still ongoing, is still progressing. So I would love to get some questions on my research. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiju. And that's always the case. There's always more to say about all of these issues. So thank you for concisely laying that out. We will now turn to Amy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jeff and Camila, for organizing for having me this Peace Week panel. I'll try to share my panel, my screen right now. So my name is Amy, and yeah, I am a master's student at the University of Malta and George Mason University, but I'm also a research assistant within the Better Evidence Project. I'm happy to be here and share insights about my research that I've been doing about farmer-herder conflicts in the Sahel during my time at the Better Evidence Project. And I'll try to bring a perspective that enables us to bridge theory with practice. So I'll see and I'll tackle what the literature says about potential gaps and future recommendations for policymakers and practitioners. So I'd like to start with my interest in the Sahel, as I've done my research in Mali, and then thanks to the Better Evidence Project, I got the opportunity to expand my interest and knowledge and research on the Sahel in West Africa, and specifically targeting this particular type of conflict called farmer-herder conflict. So I'll try to explain what the literature says about it. It's kind of an umbrella term that implies more than what it seems, because it's not only a conflict between groups, but it also involves, it's not only a conflict between farmer and herders, but it also involves, at least I argue, and it's what I found in my research, a more multidimensional nature that actually embraces other aspects such as politics, demographics, economics, and societal aspects. So why the Sahel? The Sahel because it's it's characterized by an volatile and fragile and also very dynamic landscape in terms of security. And what I've done within my research was to map countries affected by this type of conflict, and then see where the predominant, what were the predominantly affected countries. And it emerged that Nigeria and Ghana actually were among the one that showed a potential and were the most affected, and also showed patterns of similarities. And that's why I decided to bring these two case studies today. But going back to what actually means, it's about a fight between communities. That's why it could also be called intercommunal violence. And it is also connected to what we experience and see being climate change, although the nexus that links conflict and climate change doesn't actually tackle the farmer-herder conflict in the specific. So we can see there is a gap in literature. And here I try to map what actually means. So we know that Sahel, for example, it doesn't mean necessarily conflict among herder and farmers, but also criminal activities, extremism. And so I try to map what other factors are involved. We know the land is characterized by overpopulation. We know there is at the very basis, it's rooted in the competition over natural resources. Climate change, of course, is affecting stability, as I mentioned, but then it's also a question of identity, ethnicity, and religions, and multiple religions in the land. And so when I was trying to see what it's out there and what is functioning, what is working, I kind of identified a few gaps, being the fact that a very gender sensitive focused approach is still lacking. There are a few initiatives specifically by workshops created by the UN that try to fulfill this gap, but at the same time, I feel that a more, in terms of local community engagement, could be beneficial to focus on the youth, for example, and on children. And so that's what my research at the Better Evidence Project allowed me to see. And it is also true that some authors see it as isolated incident, but it's actually not true. At least we have a peak in we have peaks of violence. So even though, for example, in Nigeria there was a moment of silence in terms of violence because there were elections, we also see how oftentimes the conflicts arise again. So it was interesting to see how it is sparkled, what is driven by, and what other implications it might have. And so what should we tell to policymakers and practitioners? What should we, not in a very humble way, in the sense of what the research says and what can be the beneficial and potentially useful aspects to research. And so through the case studies of Nigeria and Ghana, I am quickly going to touch upon how the conflict took place and between whom. So for the Nigeria case, we have violence characterized between cattle herders and farmers in the Plateau State, being translated into food insecurity, and the conflict takes oftentimes shape of mass killings. The result is that a lot of people are displaced, there are refugee crisis, and women and children are, of course, as the vulnerable part of society, the most affected. And linked to climate change is kind of what is common between Nigeria and Ghana. And then what I wanted to tackle and to investigate more is the role of ethnicity and particularly identity, because the more I researched, the more I was thinking that the conflict, it could kind of be read through the lens of social identity theory, because it has and it shows patterns of majority versus minority dynamics. There are a lot of relative deprivation in terms of economic inequalities. So it was interesting to look at the conflict through this perspective, utilizing theory, and then see what can be done and what is useful for practice. Kind of similar pattern for Ghana. So Fulani are ethnic group active in West Africa, but also Red Sea and Sudan, West Africa and Sahel. And so it's an ethnic group, I wouldn't say minority, but it's actually experiencing marginalization dynamics, especially in Ghana, in northern Ghana. And so we can see that in Ghana, the conflict between farmers and nomadic, because the Fulani, I didn't mention this, but are a nomadic population, is even more worsened by the fact that 80% of the the land is controlled by traditional authorities, which makes difficult to the Fulani to have access to land, because they are not entitled to even participate to the Ghanaian census. So it is they are affected by this huge marginalization and complex dynamics. And then what I wanted to suggest, and I mentioned that social identity theory could be a useful tool in peace building. So if we read the conflict and we look, as it has also been mentioned in other presentations, to the role of identity, to the importance of identity, and how it actually could define, well, it's true that identity might not sparkle immediately conflict, but when it comes and takes place, it actually worsen and change all the dynamics. So it could be beneficial to look at this. And then these are a few concepts, such as the fact that groups usually come together and in terms of searching a shield and searching security when conflict comes and arise, and therefore they choose security over freedom. But also there are dynamics of envy, a group that are envious about what the other group might have in terms of land and access to natural resources, but also access to water. So this could be a good way to present the overview. But also in terms of very specifically local communities engagement, according to peacebuilding theory, but also peacebuilding approaches in general, it's interesting to start from the question what peace and justice actually mean to the communities affected, and then start from there and build conflict resolution approach, because they might provide different answers, and they might it might be something that it's actually doable, because for example, could be the literature mentions that perhaps a different distribution of land or property, or simply the notable saying sorry and forgiveness principles are actually what matters to people. And so I was analyzing, going to my conclusion, what is out there, what traditional approaches are. And so, yes, there is a lot of engagement with local governments and local authorities. It's usually what is usually done is to reach out to farmer association, NGOs, and humanitarian NGOs and promote local peace building initiatives. But what then they truly means is another different story. And then strengthen the criminal justice system and practice restorative justice. But what I was looking then at some different alternatives. Of course, my research is based on English and French sources, but not on primary sources. I'm not conducting interviews. I haven't done field work yet, unfortunately, but I would be happy to. So what I'm presenting is, of course, based on secondary sources. Anyway, since connected was what I was saying before, so asking what is your definition of peace, what is your definition of justice, is linked to an interest-based negotiation approach. So negotiation could actually be beneficial because this particular technique is focused on what is the interest of the group and tackles what is the ultimate goal. So it is a very concrete and practical approach, but it could be something to consider. And then according to realistic conflict theory, what I said before, concepts like relative deprivation could be considered in the game, and also maybe strengthening the economic interdependence between groups, because then it would be different and hard to deconstruct such interdependence. And then grievances-based preventive approach, tackling the underlying drivers of the conflict, as I said, trying to tackle and fill the gender-sensitive gap, and then trying to maybe bring to the table transitional justice and truth commissions, although they are usually done at the end of post-conflict societies, but they could still be something to consider. So yeah, my final considerations are definitely consider not only farmer-herder conflicts for what the name is, or the definition might be, but consider what they actually imply, and then engage with the community in terms of specifically engaging women and youth. And then think outside the box with preventive and innovative or alternative strategies that are not already there. But also it's always a good way in peace building to develop mutual trust and social healing through forgiveness, empathy, and exercising dialogue and storytelling. So thank you. That's my presentation. I am happy to answer any questions and to discuss this more. I'm still learning about the topic, but it's been a lovely journey so far.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. And I think you can see that one of the things we're emphasizing is the value of different levels of analysis. And so let's move now to a different level of analysis and very much at the basic community level. And our final presentation will be from Isabella.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you, Camila, also for organizing this, and to all the panelists. Your presentations are unique and amazing as well. So I'm gonna present today what has been my experience within the peace building field, but more explicitly bringing this theory and practice, because I feel like that is one of the key bases for anything that can be done in the field. So my project that I did in Colombia was called Inside the Daily, and it was built along with the community in Hamundi. I'll explain that, but it's about tangible peace building. So the basis of this project was doing anything and everything in peace building from praxis, and trying to embrace and embody praxis, which is a process using theory or something that you have learned in a practical way. So this is why all my studies that I have reached so far with the Carter School and with George Mason University, I tried to put it in implementation and then also learn from this experience to bring it back. So it has been like a mutual cycle of learning, and it's reflection for a effective transformation. So this project was made in the Corregimiento de San Isidro, which is a geostrategic location that has a proximity. It's here in the Pacific part of Colombia. It's called Hamundi, and it's in Valle del Cauca. This is Valle del Cauca, Colombia. Here you can see like the community. It's a small line, as you can see here. Like this is like the main street of the community I work with. So it was like you saw the whole street, and you saw like how the street was in that part of the community, and they had like pretty much all of these, like whatever was beyond this. So it was a strategic location because it was next to Cali, which is here, and the Panamericana Road and Cauca River. This is why during the conflict, especially in the conflict that took part in that place, it was such a strategic location for armed groups to mobilize drugs and different type of illicit activities, because it was so like it has many points connected to it. So that's why. Yeah, I was talking about praxis and how this is a key. This was key for like the whole project. And you can see like this is reflection for transformation. And now this is where I was telling you that this is Valle del Cauca and this is the Panamericana Road. Here is Cali, and this is the community, like what you see. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is the community, which is a street, like a whole street, where you could like see the community from afar, but you saw the whole community. That is what is so important, like proximity, and that is why this area was such a strategic location during the armed conflict, which transformed during the years. So this was possible thanks to the community council of Hamundi, and there are like the community council of Black communities in that specific area. This was possible to each one of them, to the kids, to the youth leaders who also helped, because I was not the only facilitators. We did workshops during 6 weeks. I was not the only facilitator. There were also two that were local, and they were my age, and they were completely like very good at it. And this was possible thanks to each one of them and the local people that also embraced and gave me the ideas, and we all worked together to make them possible. So as you can see, this is a place of the community council. Like this is like the place where they do events and all of that. So they have already worked towards embracing the culture, embracing peace, embracing good non-violent mechanisms to respond to problems. So this approach, from the beginning, the idea was to do that partnership, that close partnership with the community. That's why because it was an investigation, but it was truly a participatory action research, and it was assets-based. So what I mean by assets-based is that it focused on the strengths of the community. So it didn't focus on what can be or what has been done, like what violent things has been done, but rather more on like the strengths that are taking place in the community. So that this is why we try to embrace these spaces for transformation in consciousness, expanded awareness, and embodied engagement with everybody who participated, including myself, who I learned a lot from each person in the community. And this project was based on cultural assertion and inner well-being, because this was seen as the basis of peace. Because peace, the important thing of this project was to connect peace not only between people, but between people that, like within themselves, between communities, between people, and between people and nature. So it was this whole project focused on the community's voices, interests, and needs. That's why since the beginning, we were talking to each other every time before I went there, because I was studying here. So we communicated each time. We had meetings with the community council for them to see and talk about what they need. And this was, we tried with this project to grasp and promote actions addressing social issues that were taking place in the community and are still taking place. And the basis of participatory action research is for transparency and to make real action based on what the community needs. So there is a difference between research approaches. So they normally, especially within these powerful countries, research conducted in other countries that are considered in development, they tend to go to a savior or provider role. So they bring certain tools to the communities and things like that, not even kind of like conversing about what the community needs. And that's why the experiences and voices of the community are reduced or excluded many times in research. So sometimes it's just like the information of the community is extracted, but rather not the voices amplified or the experiences really seen. And this also enables hegemonic intrusion and preserve hierarchies, because many times when this type of extraction takes place, it shows a superiority from the local and indigenous communities, because it kind of like just extracts and really doesn't take into account the interests or the talents or strengths of a community. That's why with a participatory action research, it's more about every person involved being a collective agent of change and somebody who can do decision making in these type of projects. And this is a great support of agency and empowerment, because it's not about going to a community thinking that they can be saved, but rather know that they can save themselves because of their agency and empowerment. And it focuses because the compass is the local voices, is the local strengths, is the local emotions, so the locals can embrace those things, and they can do all of those things thinking that they have support rather than that they are being told what to do, or just like being used as just subjects for an investigation. So as you can see, this mural was done in also the place I told you about, the room where the community council do events. So they have that agency, they have that empowerment. It's just helping them with tools, because they have what it takes for them to become more able to be leaders, agents of change, and empowered. So in this project, what worked is the authentic partnership, is calling them partners, is seeing them as the equals, because that's how a project really is effective, when locals and outsiders are seen as equals. And especially because they are the professionals from their lands. They know about their issues, their realities. They are the professionals from that. So it's about kind of like mutual helping and gathering knowledge, like from both ways. Other thing that worked was complementing strengths. So as you see, like they did a mural before, this was 5 years ago, but it was neglected because it had not been restored. So knowing that they love that art, that type of like embracing their culture, we created another mural. Well, we painted again another mural with the youth, with things that the elders wanted us to paint. So it was like that, like complementing the strengths. And for example, I worked with the facilitators which had a school of football, and many of the kids that were in the school of football went to the workshops, and that is strengthened like their cooperation, their support, their solidarity, their leadership, and the way that they saw conflict. So without that school that they already had, many of the kids maybe wouldn't have not gone to the workshops. So this is why complementing strengths is the best part and is the most important part of like the whole project. And also it's a focus on the individual, so focusing on the well-being of each individual, and also building trust with each of the participants that enable more effectiveness, because they were more inspired, they wanted to do more, they felt better. So that in a collective is what makes peace palpable. So one of the members of the community, which his agent of like that works for the environment, he said that the it says here in the quotes that the environment is part of what we are, is part of our lives. So these type of ideas are important to incorporate in any project, like those ideas, those visions, those what they perceive as peace, what they perceive as coexistence is key to any project. As also Amy was mentioning, how what they think of peace and justice is key because it's unique. So that's why I incorporate, like this was also key for this project. And one of the community members, which she was also from another community to make justice within this community, she mentioned that we know our territories and our traditions. So they are like the experts in this. They are the experts in their lands, in their territory, their traditions. That's why with this project, we embrace culture, their traditions. Like we try to keep that up because that are seeds of culture and also cultural peace. So these are some images of what it meant, like actions that mean peace, and rather than maybe more abstract notions of peace, this is what the participants could see as peace, working together, collaborating, embracing their own ideas, embracing their own well-being. It all meant peace. And for example, another thing that we did in the project was planting some seeds to make a garden, to make a medicinal plant garden. And this also meant, this was a metaphor as well, that to understand that each one of them can do peace, can cultivate seeds of peace, and that it would nurture if they all work together to keep it up. So this was part of it. And one of the members also said that the idea is not what the person has learned remains there, but that the person continues transmitting the knowledge and learning, and that each one appropriates, well, everything that surrounds us, and that they do not forget where they come from, and all of that is useful. So this is key because the main thing of this project was for looking at the long term and sustainability. And this is the only way that this can happen if the participants feel that ownership of the whole process, of each activity, of each thing that is done. Because if they feel that ownership, they would embrace it, so that they create that leadership to continue with peace actions, continue with more, even more, because many of the community members talked about more ideas beyond the project to continue, and to continue things that can like push for better projects that stay for the longer, stay more sustainable, because they're the ones that really can transform their realities. And that is something that we were trying to explain to them and kind of make them see as well. So thank you very much, and I hope that this was a good example about bridging that theory and practice, because yeah, the best thing that can be done, especially, is about bringing those tools and working them along with the community, and embracing that outside tools and local knowledge to, in order to learn from that and do something in a practical way. Because for them and for me in that experience, peace was not something much written, but it was something that we could see when we played, when we talked, when we hugged the participants, things like that, when we planted seed, when we painted a mural, when they talked about what they didn't like, what they liked. It is like peace is about that agency and empowerment that they bring from themselves, but through inspiration and tools. So thank you very much. And I hope that you
Thank-
can see the rest of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Isabella. And thank you to all the presenters. Um, we got a really very rich sense of what constitutes learning and what we learn from. And it's not that, one approach is more powerful than another. We went from, Angie's really, really deep dive into one aspect of the conflict in Syria and brought that deep lens of economic analysis and the private, public or private governmental sector connection. And then Hiju showed us the real value of quantitative analysis that can inform how we think about sort of mass mobilization and the, nonviolent, violent movements and so on. And Amy was able to connect sort of the broad regional situation to a specific nature of the conflicts that oftentimes exist in that region and oftentimes are at the heart of some of the more identity-based conflicts there. And Isabella then took us into a community that had been affected by war and violence and gave us a very different type of lens into sort of peace building. So that's a lot of what the Carter School embraces, what the Better Evidence Project embraces. And so I really appreciate all four of you helping us to see the interconnectedness and the value of different types of research and different levels of analysis. We have a few minutes. Questions from all of you who have joined this discussion. Please feel free to either raise your hand, literally and virtually, or put a question in the chat. Well,
And I think we did get one question in the chat.
Okay. Do you want to go ahead and read it out, Camila?
Yeah, so the question was for Angie. And it looks like Justine said, I'm wondering how to connect further about your research into Syria. I'm currently conducting research specifically on, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Rojava, and want to further explore the future of this research.
I responded to Justin. I shared my email.
Okay, great. See, already there's the great connection. I'm going to ask a question of Hiju. Because one of your data points surprised me, and it may not be the one that surprised you. But it was the significant the duration of nonviolent campaigns really stood out to me because they're so much shorter than all other methods of mobilization. What is your interpretation of why that is? And is the implication, because there seemed to be a connection of nonviolence to actually sort of more democracy resulting, is the implication that there needs to be more support for nonviolent campaigns so that they can be extended, and if they are extended, they will have greater impact?
Yeah, so there can be two explanations on the very short length duration for nonviolent mobilization in my data set. Is that first would be maybe my data is wrong. So There are let me see. So the sample size for the nonviolent campaign is about 1,600, while the data point for total mass mobilization is over 8,000. So that's probably why where the all the missing information happened. And my second possible explanation is that while the even if the mass mobilization started as non-violent, as the time goes by, it can develop as a violent campaign. And at that point, the duration of the non-violent counting stops, and then the violent campaign, the counting for the duration for violent campaign starts. So that's probably why. So if that's the case, I need to look into the data, but if that's the reason why the average duration for nonviolent campaign is like significantly less than a year, then yeah, we should come up with some support to extend the duration for nonviolent campaigns.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Do any of the presenters have questions for their colleagues? Well, I've one other question I'll ask, and I wanted to ask Amy. One of the things I found fascinating about your look at sort of the conflicts was, and you started by talking about the Sahel more broadly, and then focused specifically on Nigeria and Ghana. Is what we're seeing in Nigeria, and maybe less Nigeria, but certainly Ghana, is there a spillover from the Sahel and the challenges of the loss of arable land and the desertification of the Sahel? Has that spilled over into sort of the farmer-herder dynamics due to climate change that's moving southward from the Sahel? Or could we say that the pressures and the problems that exist in the Sahel in countries like Burkina Faso and Mali and so on, they have created conditions for violent extremism that are spilling over into, say, Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire or Guinea, in part because of the kind of pressures in those countries and the way in which politically there's increased recruitment and promotion of violent extremism or extremism in the countries that you looked at?
Yeah, wow. Very true question. I'd say it's a complicated situation, and it's also all interconnected. So when you were saying that it's a spillover, I'd say it's like a perfect metaphor or expression to say what is actually happening in the Sahel, because as you mentioned, political situation, recruitment mechanisms by terrorist or criminal activities are playing a role, definitely. But on the other hand, we do have climate change, and what is the role of farmer-herders conflict in all of this, you know? So if I have to say an answer to your question would be, I see the situation as one factor affecting the other, and the crisis that we are currently witnessing is so challenging, complicated, and multifaceted that it is hard to provide a specific one go answer, but in Ghana, the northern conflict in Ghana and the Fulani marginalization is something that, you know, the Fulani are not only in Ghana, as I mentioned, it's a population that lives all over Sahara, West Africa, Sahel, but also on the other in Sudan and more on the Red Sea. So we see how geographically it's embracing all different lands. And so I'd say it's a question of not only geography and not only climate, but also how do we justify this type of violence, and how do we kind of contain it, where do we put limits and boundaries, and what are the strategies in place so that can be adopted if all these factors come into a place. So it is very difficult to determine one unilateral approach that doesn't consider also all of the other aspects. So specifically for Ghana, northern Ghana, I'd say marginalization of the Fulani is something that it should be more attention on, and it is so interconnected, yes, to the nomadic activity that they have and linked also to climate change, but what are the strategies in place? I think it's very hard to determine. So that's my understanding from my research. And yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a straight answer to that in a more positive answer, let's say. That would be my analysis from the situation. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've run out of time, and I want to thank all the presenters for very rich and very thorough, not only presentations, but commend you on your research. I personally learned a lot from each one of you, and I hope everyone else did. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you find other sessions to join for Peace Week. So thank you all very much. Greatly appreciated.